We are working through the prophets right now. Not really overly aggressive and not overly boring, I don't think. But what we're trying to do is get a sense of who the prophets were. The second piece of that is get a sense of what it means to be prophetic. And maybe, if we're lucky, we help you find a little bit of a prophetic voice yourself. I know that's scary, but that's not intended to be scary. It's just intended to be the alternative voice in our world. You see, we live in a kind of a dark place. It doesn't feel that way, but it is. Okay, maybe not that dark, but it feels kind of that dark sometimes. And all of this stuff rushing around us, and we just need an alternative voice from time to time to speak something different, to speak something new, to speak something real about who God is and how that impacts our life. And so that's what we've been trying to do with this series, is look at the prophets. What are they doing? Where are they going? And then how can we imitate that? And not that we're trying to not imitate Jesus, but just to name this real quick, I'm going to keep doing this. Jesus finds himself in line with the prophetic tradition. He speaks like a prophet. He calls people back to the roots like a prophet. He even begins his ministry by opening from a prophetic word and telling the people, and today this has been fulfilled in your presence. And they all would have been like, you heretic, you can't talk like that, don't say that. And they tried to run him out of town, a whole big deal, right? But Jesus finds himself squarely within the prophetic tradition. And so it should be something we take a look at and go, who are we and what are we supposed to be doing? As we explore the prophets, here's one hard thing about the prophets. There's a lot of hard things about the prophets. One, you open it up, and a lot of it's poetry. A lot of it has these obscure references to people or places, and it just is difficult for us to wrap our heads around. Who are they speaking to? What is this really about? Is this about the future? Is this about now? How does this make sense to me? And so one of the things that's important as we look at the prophets is figuring out where they're coming from and what the situation of life is. So when we open these up, so we started with Moses, and we looked at where Moses was and how he spoke truth into a world that was dominated by Egypt. And then we moved into the kings, and a lot of, there are a few prophets within the period of the kings that are either employed by the king, and that's a scary word, right? You think the person that's supposed to give you truth is on your payroll. They may not be doing that for you, right? Then we move into later periods, and what happens is Israel goes through this huge struggle with survival, with themselves, with their understanding of who God is, and they get into a place where the prophets have to call them back to hope. And that's what I want to do this morning, is move into this place of hope. So we're going to tell a couple of stories as we move along. The first story I want to tell is about Israel itself. Israel told themselves a story. As we looked at the kings last week, they cried out for a king to look like the other nations. They cried out for a king that would put order around their borders. Kings bring with them affluence. They bring wealth. They bring a certain amount of security. When you have a state-run military, when you have a state-run religion, they bring order. They bring consistency. They bring all kinds of things that frankly make us feel good about our life and ourselves. This worked as expected. It did everything it was supposed to do. The problem is that within that state, they had a story that they told themselves about who God was. You see, these are God's people, and they told themselves that every day. We are God's people. Here's how we worship. Here's where we worship. Here's what it looks like. Here's what God is going to do for us. And remember those promises to Abraham when God says, I'm going to make you into a great nation with more offspring than the number of sand, more offspring than the number of stars in another place. Israel is telling themselves this story over and over, that God is going to bless them with all of this. And as they go along and things start to break down, guess what happens? Their God is tied to their affluence. Their God is tied to their political well-being. Their God is tied to their state. When they struggle, their relationship with God struggles. It's not a whole lot different than today. We tie our God to all kinds of things. Sometimes it is actually wealth. We say, I know that I'm blessed because, I know that God loves me because I'm blessed. We say, I know that if I follow God properly, God will bless me. All of those things teach us that when we come to struggle, that our relationship with God falls apart, just like our life is falling apart before our eyes. So not only then do we lose maybe a house in a separation or in a moment of job loss, we also lose our faith because it was tied to our house or our well-being. This is the story that Israel told themselves. And so as they go along and they struggle and other nations come in and take them over, they look for ways to understand what is happening in their world. What's going on? Why is this happening to us? Who are we? Where do we belong? And all of that structure and life and affluence and security falls apart. So during the kings, we have some prophets that are there, sometimes that speak up out against them, but a lot of the times are reinforcing the state religion, reinforcing the state laws. So before we get too far, I want to start another story, and then we'll come back to that. I'm going to tell you a story about a guy named, this is not his real name, but they call him Carlos. I was listening to a podcast, Malcolm Gladwell, it's phenomenal, on just life. And he goes and interviews people and finds great stories. And so he's interviewing Carlos and somebody that's been helping him out. Carlos comes from a low-income family outside of LA. He is incredibly smart and talented and just simply brilliant. And there's a lawyer that has made the last 12 years of his life dedicated to finding kids that are in low-income or impoverished schools and getting them access to private education, getting them access to the tools that they need to move into university someday. And Carlos is one of these stories. And what's fascinating is that he says, Carlos isn't unique. This is a great story about Carlos, but Carlos isn't unique. Hundreds and thousands of kids are in the same place as Carlos that don't have, as Gladwell puts it, that don't have a high-powered Jewish lawyer behind their backs to help them get through it. So he meets Carlos in a school. He's excelling, but he's running into constant barriers. He struggles to eat well with his family. He struggles to have shoes and clothes and things that you shouldn't have to think about as a child. But he is focused on his grades. Carlos knows that his only opportunity to get out of this place is getting a good education, getting good grades, and getting past this dark moment in his life. But he's got barriers. You see, he grew up in a school that is struggling, that doesn't have the teacher to student ratio that he needs to do that well. He grows up in a school that ends at grade 8. And grade 9, they don't have a school in his city that starts with grade 9. He has to go to another community to study in high school. In fact, to do that, by the time they're in grade 8, this community, most of the kids are already related with a gang. 80% are gang related by the time they're in grade 8. To go into grade 9 in the other community, they have to cross gang lines to go into this other school. So by the time you get into grade 9, maybe you've made the jump to cross the gang lines. Maybe you've continued to study, but then you also have to continue past. By the time you're in grade 12, 90% of the kids are gang related. Then you have to take the SATs or some kind of standardized test so that you can get into a school. Then you have to be able to apply, which costs money. A middle-class family can apply to 6 or 7 schools. He might have one shot if he's willing to put the money into the testing and the applications. So this high-powered Jewish lawyer doing good gets him into a private school, helps him study, and just when he's about to get into this school, his family, he goes into foster care in the summer. And his mom calls on him to not go to the school, which would take him out of his household, so that he can take care of his sister. And so one thing after the next, you see this kid's story struggle. And one thing he might get past. One barrier he might overcome. But as you see the decks just stacked and stacked and stacked against him. You see, we tell ourselves that we all have opportunity. We tell ourselves if we make the right decisions, if we go to the right places, we all have the opportunity. Sometimes we tie this back to our religion, back to our faith. God will help me through this. But the deck just keeps getting stacked and stacked against some of us. Israel was in this same place. They've told themselves, God is going to get us through this. God is going to help us survive. But in a state religion, you find whatever you can cling to that helps you tell that story over and over, even when it doesn't look like it. And so when the Assyrians come in like mid-700s to overtake Israel, Judah survives, the temple survives. They continue telling their story. God will rise up and bring us out of this. But when Judah falls in the 500s, all hope is lost. The decks are too stacked. We can't fix this. We can't get out of here. You see, it's Carlos's story. Often our story, we're in different places. We go through different things. Sometimes it's depression. Sometimes it's job loss. Sometimes it's fighting with growth, personal growth, getting out of a job or into a new job. We sometimes find the deck stacked against us. This isn't very hopeful yet, but I'll get there. Just hang in there. So here is this Israel story that is struggling. Remember, that's their name, to struggle. That is struggling to survive, struggling to continue that story about who God is. And the prophet's role is to speak an alternative voice. And here's what happens in the 500s. When Judah is overtaken by Babylon, the Babylonians pull out the top 20% of the elite in the community. And they send them to different places. And what it does is it politically just ruins your community, right? You can see that occurring. If we came in to Maple Ridge and removed the top 20% in the political world, in the business world, in our community government and other areas, it would be a decimated community trying to figure out, well, what do we do now? Who do we follow? What does this look like? This is what happens. political devastation, religious devastation, all of that is gone. And they move them into a new community. And so they just hole up. It is quite interesting to watch. They just hole up. They live in their houses and they just wait. They're just waiting for God to fix things because they don't know what to do or where to go. And it is the prophetic voice that is willing to stand up and to speak hope into a completely hopeless situation. We talk about hope a lot, right? Does anybody get a definition for me? No? Optimism? Yeah. And to add, I think that's a good start. Add to it optimism in a place that the status quo is overwhelming. Right? It is the willingness to dream that something's going to change, even though it doesn't look like it could. And so Israel, in this place of complete devastation, has to find their prophetic voice, has to find their willingness to stand up and say, no, actually, we can make this work. That's the prophetic voice that's going to come. So we're going to look just briefly at a few different places in Isaiah. So Isaiah has 3 parts to it. This is confusing. You don't need to know all of it. But just briefly, Isaiah has 3 parts here. Part 1, right, is before the Babylonians take over. And it goes roughly through chapter 39. Part 2, this prophetic voice tells us about speaking into a nation that is living in exile. So you've been removed from your homeland, you've been decimated politically, religiously, financially, and part 2 tells that story on how to speak an alternative voice into the most devastating of situations. And so Isaiah chapter 40 begins with this: "Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and cry to her that her warfare is ended, that her iniquity is pardoned." You see, immediately Isaiah gives them a different voice because everything is doom and gloom and despair. Everything is that moment in Carlos's story where no one can win. There is no way out. There is no high-powered Jewish attorney to come and rescue you. Or Israel attorney, whatever. And the story continues, and the prophet is continually giving them an alternative voice to stand up and live in a world that God can rule in the midst of this devastation. And so as he continues, he says in chapter 46, "Bel bows down, Nebo stoops. Their idols are beasts and cattle. These things you carry are loaded as burdens on weary beasts. Hearken to me," this is skipping back, "hearken to me, O house of Jacob, all the remnant, the house of Israel, who have been born by me from your birth. Carried from the womb, I have made and I will bear. I will carry and I will save." You see that burden, those idols that they're carrying? Because under a state religion, you grasp to everything. Under the restrictions of here's who your God is, you grasp to anything and you carry the burden on your back. Quite literally, you carry the idols on your back. But the burden is on you to allow that voice to be there. And immediately Isaiah says, listen, it's bigger than that. It's better than that. God is a free God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, who gave a voice to you and has rescued you time and time again. And he says, I have made you. I will bear you. I will carry and I will save you. That's an alternative voice. That's a voice hearing God's love and speaking alternative value into who we are and what we're doing. So how do we talk about this in the midst of this world? How do we take the despair that we experience in our lives personally, but also in our communities as we step out in faith to answer or to respond differently to the world? How do we take this voice with us? This voice that says, you don't have to carry that burden. Sometimes it's about simply letting go. Sometimes it's simply about letting go of those expectations, letting go of the connection between God and your suffering. That's such a hard one for us, right? It's such a hard time removing those two pieces. But the reality is, God speaks truth into these moments and offers an alternative voice for us to live by, to love, to care for, to see the world differently. In this case, that alternative voice is that high-powered Jewish attorney willing to put his neck on the line to help a Carlos and hundreds others step out of their poverty and their oppression and their life of despair. Carlos didn't go to that school. He dropped off the map for over a year, in fact, jumping from foster home to foster home, pleading with the system, fighting with the system to keep him and his sister together so that they could be a force in their own lives. And when he comes out of it, his high-powered Jewish attorney is there ready for him to get him into a closer school that he can still care for his family, to get him moving beyond that barrier. In our own lives, we don't always have that. Here's the alternative voice. Here's what we get to do. You may not have it for yourself, but you can have it for somebody else. I've watched people in the depths of depression step out and care for other people. Guess who it helps? Both of them. Guess who gets to see God in a whole new way, in a whole new light? Both of them. I've watched our world that says we can be anything and go anywhere crumble under the expectations that we're going to be anywhere and everywhere. And anything or whatever. We've watched our world that says that we don't have to suffer, that life will fix itself and will always come out ahead, crumble in the face of faith, trying to tell ourselves, well, if God was here, I wouldn't be suffering. We have to be that alternative voice, and we can be, in one kind of way, that high-powered Jewish attorney caring for our neighbor. In small ways, in big ways, in ways that are physical, a room, a bed, a few dollars, a friendly voice, coffee. Those are small ways that we have the opportunity to be the alternative voice in our community. Just to be a bit more cynical before we go, here's what I've watched. Personally, I think this is the case. I've watched our churches as a collective body, a unit, whatever. I've watched our churches tell us that we can, I'll say this without being too harsh, that we can have all of that we can go anywhere, and that God's going to take us there. I've watched our churches box up God. We did a little bit of this last week. Box up God and tell us how to access that resource so that we can grow and become and be. And the God of the prophets is a free God. that acts, cares, steps out, chooses to love in the midst of despair, chooses to care in the midst of oppression. We get to be that voice. You get to be that voice. The prophetic voice, the prophet's voice that we're looking for is yours in a harsh world right now.